They bound him tightly and abandoned him in the middle of a desolate road, discarding him like garbage before speeding off, their laughter echoing into the night. To them, it was the highlight of their evening, a twisted joke they thought they'd never regret. Little did they know they had crossed the wrong person. This isn't a tale of forgiveness, it's a story that demands we go back to where it all began. James Carter, a 52-year-old police chief, recently appointed to lead his hometown's department, was eager to restore integrity and eliminate corruption. Returning to the community where he grew up, James had a clear mission to rebuild trust and set a higher standard for law enforcement. His reputation as a disciplined and principled leader preceded him, but not everyone was thrilled about the changes he planned to bring. Driving home one quiet evening in an old truck, wearing casual clothes and a familiar red MAGA cap, James was lost in thought about the reforms he planned to implement. Suddenly, lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Assuming it was a routine stop, he pulled over calmly, unaware this encounter would set the tone for his first day on the job. Two officers, Mark Hansen and Todd Green, approached with an air of arrogance. Despite James identifying himself as the new chief, the officers mocked him, dismissing his authority. What began as a simple traffic stop quickly escalated, turning into an act of humiliation that would test James's resolve and leadership on his first day. Officer Mark Hansen, tall and imposing with a perpetual smirk, led the way, while his partner, Todd Green, followed closely behind, twirling his baton with an air of arrogance. James rolled down his window, greeting them calmly. "Evening, officers. Is there an issue?" "Your headlights out," Hansen said, leaning casually against the truck as if it belonged to him. James nodded, maintaining a respectful tone. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll address it first thing tomorrow." He handed over his license and registration, fully compliant and expecting the matter to be resolved quickly. But things took an unexpected turn. Green circled the truck, tapping it with his baton, his voice dripping with mock suspicion. "You're awfully calm for someone pulled over on a deserted road. Got somewhere important to be, Grandpa." James smiled faintly, keeping his composure. Just heading home after a long day. No rush. Sensing the escalating hostility, he decided to clarify his position. "By the way, I'm the new chief of police. This must be a misunderstanding." The officers exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. Hansen mocked, "Chief of police?" "That's Rich." Green joined in, shaking his head. "Sure thing, Chief. What's next?" Running for mayor, the situation had taken a humiliating turn James hadn't anticipated. The situation quickly spiraled out of control as officers Mark Hansen and Todd Green took their unwarranted stop to an entirely different level. Despite James Carter's calm demeanor and full compliance, the two officers seemed more interested in asserting their authority than following proper procedure. Hansen, with a mocking grin, gestured for James to step out of the truck. "Let's make sure everything checks out," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. James frowned but remained cooperative, calmly responding, "I've already given you my documents. There's no reason for this." Hansen smirked, his voice taking on a sarcastic edge. "What's this?" "Questioning procedure now. You either step out or we help you out. Your choice." Understanding the need to avoid escalating the situation further, James unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the truck, standing tall despite the growing hostility. No sooner had he exited than Green moved in behind him, grabbing his arms and yanking them roughly behind his back. "Whoa. What's this about?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just being thorough," Green sneered, snapping the handcuffs tightly around James's wrists. Hansen chuckled, rummaging through the contents of the truck without a word of explanation. He began tossing items onto the ground carelessly, a bag of groceries, an old jacket, and finally James's well-worn red cap. Holding it up like a trophy, Hansen smirked. Well, look at this. Big patriot over here. Think this makes you untouchable." James's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold, his patience wearing thin. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly, locking eyes with the officers. But his words only seemed to amuse them further. Green tightened the cuffs unnecessarily, laughing. "What are you going to do, Chief? Write us a memo." The two officers continued to search the truck and mock James, their arrogance palpable. Hansen tossed the cap back into the truck dismissively. "Relax, old man. We're just doing our job," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. James remained silent, knowing that arguing would only embolden them. It was clear that this wasn't about a headlight anymore. These officers weren't looking for the truth, they were looking for a target. And tonight they decided that target was him. The night took a sinister turn as officers Mark Hansen and Todd Green escalated their abuse of power to alarming levels. With James Carter, the new police chief, handcuffed and seated in the back of their patrol car, the two officers exchanged smug grins, clearly enjoying their self-appointed game of humiliation. James, calm but alert, silently observed as the patrol car veered off the main road and onto an isolated, uneven dirt path surrounded by dense forest. He knew this was far from standard procedure, but he remained composed, his mind calculating his next move. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt in a deserted clearing, the only sound the faint whistle of wind cutting through the stillness. Hansen stepped out first, opening the back door with a smirk. "All right, Grandpa, out you go," he said, grabbing James by the arm and yanking him roughly to his feet. Green followed, dragging a frayed length of rope from the trunk of the car. James straightened himself, his steady demeanor masking his growing frustration. "This is excessive," he said firmly, looking between the two men. "If you've got an issue with me, let's address it back at the station." Hansen scoffed, his smirk widening. "Oh, we'll get there," he said mockingly, "but first you need to understand how things work around here," Green chimed in, shaking his head as he unwound the rope. "Yeah, Chief," he sneered. "Guess you didn't think your first day would end like this, huh?" Despite the ropes biting into his jacket and arms, James refused to show fear. Hansen and Green worked quickly, tying him tightly to an old, rusted metal post likely left behind from some long-abandoned road marker. James's muscles strained against the coarse rope, but he remained silent, his eyes locked on the two officers. "There we go," Green said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Not so tough now, are you?" Hansen snatched James's red cap from the ground, spinning it mockingly on his finger before placing it crookedly on his own head. "How do I look?" he said, laughing. "Pretty patriotic, right?" James's voice was low and steady as he responded. "This is your last warning. Let me go now. And I might consider being lenient." Hansen barked a laugh, pulling out his phone to snap a picture of James tied to the post. "Oh, don't worry, Chief," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We'll let you go. Eventually." With that, the two officers climbed back into their car, the engine roaring to life as they drove off, their laughter fading into the distance. Alone in the frigid night, James tested the ropes, but they held firm. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. If there was one thing he knew, it was how to endure, and these men would soon learn they had underestimated him. Hours passed in the biting cold as James Carter stood tied to the rusted metal post, his arms numb and his body stiff from the relentless chill. The dense forest around him was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. James focused on his breathing, maintaining his composure and determination. He knew this humiliation wasn't the end, it was just a test of his endurance. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, he heard the faint crunch of footsteps approaching through the gravel. A beam of light pierced the darkness, bouncing across the trees until it landed on James. The figure holding the flashlight came closer, a wiry man in a weathered flannel jacket and scuffed work boots. His face, lined with age and concern, mirrored the disbelief in his voice. "What in tarnation?" the man muttered, stepping closer. "What happened to you?" James squinted against the flashlight, his voice calm despite his predicament. "It's a long story, but I could use a hand getting out of this." The man set the flashlight down without hesitation, pulling a pocket knife from his jacket. "Whoever did this to you ought to be ashamed of themselves," he grumbled, sawing through the thick ropes with precision. Within moments, James was free. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the post as blood rushed back into his stiffened arms and legs. "Thank you," James said, flexing his fingers and rolling his shoulders. "You don't know how much I appreciate this." The man gave him a once-over, still trying to piece together what had happened. "You sure you're all right? You look like you've been through the ringer." James nodded, his voice steady. "I'll live. But I need to get back to the station. Some officers have a lot of explaining to do." "Cops?" the man asked, his eyes widening. "You mean they're the ones who did this to you? What the hell is going on?" "It's complicated," James replied, his tone firm. "But trust me, they're not getting away with it." The man shook his head in disbelief but offered, "My truck's parked not far from here. Let me give you a lift. This road's no place to be walking at night." After a moment's hesitation, James nodded. I appreciate it. The ride back to the station was quiet, the hum of the truck's engine filling the air. James stared out the window, his mind racing with plans. By the time they arrived, he knew exactly what he needed to do. This ordeal wouldn't define his leadership, but his response to it would. Back at the station, James Carter sat in his office, his fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the determination surging through him. He retrieved the memory card from his truck's dashcam, plugged it into his laptop, and began reviewing the footage. As the video played, James's jaw tightened. The camera had captured everything, every smirk, every sarcastic comment, every unwarranted action by officers Mark Hansen and Todd Green. The footage began with their mocking tones as they dismissed his credentials and escalated the situation without cause. The audio was crystal clear: Hansen's taunts, Green's sneering remarks, and their threats to teach him a lesson. As the video progressed, the incriminating evidence piled up: their unjustified handcuffing, rummaging through his truck, and the humiliating way they tied him to the rusted post. The final nail in the coffin was their laughter and arrogance as they drove off, believing their actions would face no consequences. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just evidence, it was irrefutable proof of their misconduct. These men had underestimated him, assuming their actions would go unnoticed. But now, with the footage in hand, James knew he had the power to hold them accountable, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next morning, officers Mark Hansen and Todd Green sat in the precinct's break room, sipping coffee and laughing over the events of the previous night. To them, it was just another amusing story to add to their collection of greatest hits. Hansen leaned back in his chair, a smug grin on his face. You should have seen the look on his face, all tied up like that. Priceless. Green chuckled, stirring his coffee lazily. And he kept going on about being the new chief, like we were actually supposed to believe that. What a joke. Their laughter echoed through the room, but it was short-lived. The door swung open, and the casual atmosphere evaporated instantly as James Carter stepped in. Dressed sharply and exuding authority, he was no longer the man they had mocked the night before. His eyes, cold and resolute, fixed on the two officers. "Good morning, gentlemen," James said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Hansen froze mid-sip, his coffee cup slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Green's spoon clattered against his mug as his hand trembled. Without waiting for a response, James set a folder on the table and opened it, revealing printed stills from the dashcam footage. Each photo captured their actions in vivid detail: their smirks, the mocking gestures, and the humiliating scene they had orchestrated. "You see these," James said, tapping the images. "These aren't just pictures, they're evidence. Evidence of gross misconduct, abuse of power, and a complete failure to uphold the standards of this department." Both officers tried to stammer an excuse, but James raised a hand, cutting them off. "Save it. I've already forwarded this to Internal Affairs, the district attorney, and the mayor. You have 5 minutes to hand over your badges. Consider yourselves lucky I'm not having you escorted out in cuffs." Stunned and defeated, Hansen and Green shuffled out, their arrogance replaced with shame. James Carter, now fully in command of the situation, took swift and decisive action to address the misconduct of officers Mark Hansen and Todd Green. After confronting them with irrefutable evidence captured on his truck's dashcam, James left no room for negotiation. He informed them, with an air of authority that left no doubt, that their actions were not just a breach of protocol but a blatant abuse of power that disgraced their badges in the department. "You have 5 minutes to hand over your badges and clear your desks," James said, his tone calm but unyielding. "Consider yourselves fortunate I'm not having you arrested here and now." True to his word, James ensured the evidence, both video and audio, was promptly sent to Internal Affairs, the district attorney's office, and even the mayor. He wanted everyone to understand the gravity of what had happened and to ensure transparency in the actions he was taking. This wasn't just about disciplining two officers, it was about sending a message to the entire department and community. As Hansen and Green left the precinct, their heads hung low in shame, James turned to address the other officers who had gathered, having overheard the confrontation. His voice was steady but firm. "Let this serve as a lesson. Corruption, abuse of power, and anything less than the highest standards of integrity will not be tolerated in this department. If you cannot meet those standards, there's the door." The room fell silent as the officers absorbed his words, standing a little straighter in recognition of their leader's resolve. James had made it clear a new era of accountability had begun, and there was no place for misconduct in his precinct. As James Carter watched Mark Hansen and Todd Green leave the precinct, their badges and pride left behind, a heavy silence hung in the air. The remaining officers who had overheard the confrontation stood gathered in the hallway, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. For years, the department had struggled under a cloud of misconduct and complacency, but today was different. James had proven he wasn't afraid to take action, no matter how difficult. The silence broke with a ripple of applause, growing steadily as the officers collectively acknowledged their leader's courage and commitment to integrity. James turned to face them, his expression firm yet resolute. "This is a turning point for our department," he said, his voice steady. "We will operate with accountability, respect, and the highest standards. Anything less will not be tolerated." The officers stood straighter, their respect for him palpable. James's actions had not just addressed corruption, they had set a new tone, giving the department a sense of hope and purpose. This story highlights the importance of accountability and integrity in leadership. What would you do in James Carter's situation? Do you think he handled this situation effectively? Share your thoughts in the comments section. We want to hear your perspective. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? Let's discuss and raise awareness. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell to spread the message. Together, we can advocate for fairness, justice, and meaningful change in our communities.